Oh. Kapow.
God had promised to make Abraham and Sarah's descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, as sands on the beach, and so on. Which seemed unlikely as they had only one son, Isaac. However, things were looking up. Isaac's wife Rebecca was carrying twins. And energetic ones at that. The first son to come out of the womb was named Esau, which meant hairy, for obvious reasons. The second to emerge was named Jacob, or heel grabber, also for obvious reasons. These were the only children Isaac and Rebecca would have. Being the firstborn son came with a lot of perks. As part of your birthright, you were entitled to inherit a majority of the family's lands, livestock and possessions, as well as your father's status. Any siblings that came after the firstborn received significantly less. Jacob, the more quiet and delicate child, rarely left the comfort of the tents and thus chose to become a shepherd. Esau, however, became a hunter, as he was much more comfortable in the wilderness and had a somewhat less subtle personality. One day, Esau, having just returned from an unsuccessful hunt, was not in his best state of mind.
Hungry. Give me red stuff.
And Jacob did what any loving family member would do. He made Esau bargain for his food.
Red stuff! Red stuff! Red stuff!
Without even haggling, Esau gave Jacob his birthright for a bowl of red stuff. But since they were teenagers, and this is absolutely ridiculous, it might not have been legally binding. Isaac grew old and went completely blind, and so decided it was time to get his affairs in order. He called in Esau to give his son a final blessing. After Esau hunted down some tasty game for Isaac to eat. Coincidentally, Rebecca had been minding her own business directly outside the tent and overheard this. She then convinced Jacob to pose as Esau and steal his blessing, which, unlike a child's bargain over a bowl of soup, would complete the hostile takeover, making Jacob the patriarch of the family. Jacob certainly liked the sound of that. Isaac was suspicious. But upon closer inspection, it felt like Esau, and it certainly smelled like Esau. And so, unwittingly, Isaac blessed Jacob, promising a large inheritance and passing on God's covenant to make the family's descendants as numerous as the stars.
Bless me! Bless me!
But it was irreversible. Isaac had nothing more to bless Esau with but the truth. He was now his brother's servant, for the amount of time that Jacob could survive Esau's attentive service. To save him from Esau's wrath, Rebecca quickly sent Jacob off to her brother Laban. Jacob had gained nothing through his tricks, save a perilous journey to live with an uncle he had never met. Before Esau and Jacob were born, God had told Rebecca that Jacob would rule over Esau. Given Jacob's current situation, this seemed unlikely. But on that night, in the depths of despair, God told Jacob it was still true, that God's covenant with Abraham resided with him. He made an altar, thanking God However, now that he was fully awake, he did want to clarify the details of this relationship. Jacob was happy to worship the God of Abraham as his God, as long as God protected him, fed and clothed him, and eventually allowed him to peacefully return to his father's home. Jacob took God's silence to be an agreement to his terms. Jacob finally arrived in Hebron and immediately met his cousin, Rachel. It had been a long trip. And so naturally, it was love at first sight.
There you go. Water.
Jacob had nothing, so taking a wife was out of the question. He worked for Laban as a shepherd and showed that he had a knack for animal husbandry. After a month, Laban generously offered to start paying Jacob something for his labor.
So, what would you...
Rachel!
This was wildly inappropriate, almost like asking for someone's birthright in exchange for a bowl of red stuff. But this time, it was Laban who took full advantage. In order to marry Rachel, Jacob agreed to work for Laban for 7 years. The wait was excruciating. And then, in the darkness of the wedding tent, Laban switched Rachel for her older sister Leah. Laban didn't mention, and Jacob didn't bother to learn, that it was tradition for the eldest daughter to be married off first. Jacob was furious and insisted on being allowed to marry Rachel. Laban conceded and let him marry Rachel a week later, in exchange for 7 more years of work. After those 7 years had passed, Jacob tried to leave. But Laban, aware he was blessed through Jacob, tried to keep him for as long as he could.
Think of the sheep.
5 years later, God told Jacob it was time to leave. Wary of Laban, Jacob left without saying goodbye. A smart man like Jacob would have settled somewhere far from Esau, but God told Jacob to return home. And Jacob, though scared, was now wise enough to listen. He had sent messengers ahead to tell Esau of his arrival in the area. Upon returning, they told Jacob that Esau was riding to meet him, with a small army. Immediately Jacob prayed for help, then got to work. He sent a bribe to Esau, hid half of his family and separated himself from the rest, so only he would face Esau's wrath. That night, he camped alone, just like the first night of his exile, only this time he was suddenly attacked. Jacob was not a young man, nor had he ever been particularly athletic, but he wrestled with the assailant all night. Just before the sun rose, his attacker tried to leave.
Let me go.
Not until you bless me!
Fine. Your name is now Israel.
It was a blessing and an observation. Jacob, heel grabber and supplanter, was now struggling for the benefit of others and had earned the double-edged name Israel, one who strives with God and shows himself ready to accept God's blessing.
Brother!
Esau had forgiven Jacob. He even invited Jacob to stay with him, but Jacob had learned caution and settled a reasonable distance away from his brother. Jacob, with his 12 sons, became the patriarch of the 12 tribes of Israel, and like his father, continued playing favorites. While Jacob had many sons, Joseph Jacob's 11th born son, was his favourite. Which might seem a bit odd, if not for the fact that he was the firstborn son of Rachel, who was presumed to be barren, and just so happened to be Jacob's preferred wife. Joseph's unlikely birth endeared him to his father. Jacob even made him a special coat, which he eventually wore everywhere. Of course, the more his father doted on Joseph, the more Joseph's brothers envied and despised the little daddy's boy. From an early age, Joseph was blessed with the ability to interpret others' dreams, and also had extremely vivid dreams of his own. Joseph would often share what he had dreamt with his brothers, which, on more than one occasion, seemed to indicate that Joseph was somehow superior to them. The last straw for his brothers was Joseph's dream in which even the sun, moon, and stars bowed to him. Joseph was either very, very vain or very, very naive. In either case, he was quite gifted at infuriating his siblings. Joseph's brothers had reached their limit with their precocious sibling and decided it was time to take Joseph out of the picture. Most of the brothers wanted to murder Joseph, but the eldest, Reuben, recommended they throw him in a well and pretend he was dead.
Hi!
Joseph hadn't comprehended his brother's jealousy until now.
Hey, guys! Good one! Guys?
As luck, or misfortune would have it, an Egyptian trader passed by. Joseph's brothers seized the opportunity and sold him into slavery for 20 shekels of silver, which was actually quite a bargain for the Egyptian. Joseph's brothers dipped his colourful coat in goat's blood and brought it to Jacob. They told him they found the coat and that Joseph must have been killed by a wild beast. Jacob was devastated. Meanwhile, Joseph found himself being sold as a slave in Egypt. He felt a bit betrayed by his brothers, but rather than despairing, he recognised he had to stay sharp and maintain faith if he was to survive. In short order, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, captain of the Pharaoh's guard. Fortunately for Joseph, Potiphar was a smart man. He recognised that Joseph was special and immediately put Joseph in charge of his household. Unfortunately for Joseph, his boss's wife also took a shine to him. Potiphar's wife came to Joseph night after night and tried to seduce him. And night after night, he sent her away frustrated. Joseph was no fool.
Get back here, you!
There was no way he'd betray Potiphar's trust by fooling around with his boss's wife.
Gotcha!
Feeling the sting of Joseph's rejection, Potiphar's wife got spiteful. She brought Joseph's torn cloak to her husband, claiming that the slave had tried to seduce her, which led to Joseph being promptly thrown in jail. But, as was the trend, Joseph quickly turned his misfortune into advancement. After interpreting dreams for his fellow inmates, word got around, and he was eventually required to interpret one of Pharaoh's dreams. Pharaoh dreamt of 7 healthy cows and 7 healthy heads of grain, being devoured by 7 sick cows and 7 diseased heads of grain. Joseph, with God's help, saw clearly the meaning of the dream. He told Pharaoh the healthy cows meant there would be 7 years of good, healthy crops, followed by 7 years of famine. He advised Pharaoh to put aside 1/5 of his harvest each year for the next 7 years, so there would be food in store when the famine came. Joseph secured Pharaoh's trust, and in return, Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of Egypt. The years passed exactly as Joseph said. 7 years of plenty were followed by 7 years of famine. Since Egypt was the only country prepared for the shortage, people travelled from all around seeking provisions, including 3 of Joseph's brothers. Joseph immediately recognized them, but they didn't recognize him. Joseph provided food for his brothers, and, after a bit of inquiry, inspired them to return with his younger brother Benjamin by holding one of them hostage. The brothers returned with Benjamin in record time. Seeing Benjamin, his only full brother, overwhelmed Joseph. But once again, he hid his true feelings, partly to see if his brothers had at all changed, and partly just to see them squirm. Joseph had a silver cup planted on Benjamin. He then accused the boy of stealing, and for punishment demanded that little Benjamin be left behind in Egypt. Knowing the loss of another son would kill their father, the brothers begged Joseph to let Benjamin go. One brother, Judah, even offered to remain in his stead. The sight of his brothers on their knees before him was too much for Joseph. Unable to hide his true identity any longer, Joseph revealed to them who he was. Joseph's entire family relocated to Egypt, and Pharaoh ensured they were well cared for. Joseph marveled at the magnitude of God's plan for him, how a silly little dream of his youth had led to events that impacted an entire generation.
This is Moses. Moses was raised in the house of Pharaoh, but he was born a descendant of Hebrew slaves. At the time of Moses' birth, Pharaoh, fearing the size of his slave population, decreed that all Hebrew newborn boys be thrown into the Nile River, and not for a swim. Fortunately for Moses, when his mother threw him into the river, she included a basket. Needless to say, when Moses came upon an Egyptian severely beating a Hebrew slave, he felt compelled to intervene.
Could you stop with the...
It was at that moment that Moses realized he had ruined his life. Moses fled Egypt, settled in a land called Midian, and became a shepherd. One day, while herding his sheep, he came upon a bush that was ablaze, and yet wasn't consumed. The bush spoke to Moses, telling him that it was the Lord God, and that Moses was to lead the Hebrew people out of Egypt to the promised land of Canaan. Moses wondered if God had confused him with someone else, someone a bit more qualified. Since childhood, Moses had always felt nervous around other people and had great difficulty speaking. Moses knew what he wanted to say, but the words seemed hesitant to come out. God suggested that Moses bring along his brother Aaron to speak for him. Let the Israelites go.
Let the Israelites go!
But it didn't seem to help. So God placed a series of plagues on Egypt, turning the water to blood, followed by a plague of frogs, gnats, flies, a plague on livestock, skin boils, hail, locusts, darkness. And then came a plague on the firstborn, which killed all of Egypt's firstborn sons, including Pharaoh's son. And finally, Pharaoh had a change of heart. But shortly after the Israelites left Egypt, Pharaoh changed his mind. Again. The Israelites found themselves trapped with their backs against the Red Sea, facing certain death. But God had a plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm thirsty!
Are we there yet?
As they made their way to the Promised Land, a majority of Moses' time was absorbed dealing with all of the people's complaining. God had never said this would be part of his job. Moses was beginning to see why God hadn't mentioned it.
What about the sand? Can't you do something about all the sand?
It was maddening. As God instructed, Moses climbed Mount Sinai and received God's laws that the Hebrews were to follow. Moses brought God's laws to the Israelites, and they unanimously agreed to follow them. And then they didn't.
Where's
God was furious and told Moses that the Israelites would be destroyed for their disobedience. Moses knew that there was no sense in him questioning God, and yet he spoke. He pleaded for God to have mercy on the Israelites, and to his complete and utter shock, God listened. As punishment for the Israelites' continued disobedience and complete lack of faith, God told Moses they were to wander in the desert for 40 years, so that none of that generation would enter the Promised Land. At 120 years of age, after 40 long years in the desert, Moses was able to send God's people into the Promised Land. Though God would not allow Moses to enter because of a certain incident. One might think this is the incident, but they would be wrong.
I'm thirsty!
God forbid Moses from entering the Promised Land for hitting a rock.
Here's your stupid water!
However, God did let Moses see the Promised Land, and it looked all right. As far as he could tell.